Welcome to this chess endgame featuring a king and pawn versus a king and two pawns. And so in this position, it looks like white is losing here, but he has a chance to draw. Can you see in this position how white will be able to do that? And so it's white's turn to move. What do you think he should do first? All right, pause this if you need time to make your decision. And if you're ready, we will show how white obtains a draw in this position. All right, let me bring up the analysis. And we see there is only one move here that white can make to hold the draw. And so that move is e7. And so now he is threatening to make a queen. And so black is forced with only one move possible to stop that queen. And so the king moves to intercept this pawn, and the pawn continues forward, promoting, and is captured. But this allows the white king to make one and only move that would hold the draw. You may be tempted to capture here, but that would be a losing move. So if we had capture, you can see that after king to d7, the white king cannot get back over immediately to block this. So because the king is covering this e6 square and the pawn is covering e5, the king would have to head down the board first. But then after king to c6 and e4, then we have king to c5 getting in front of the pawn. And after maybe d3, we have d5, and black would obtain the opposition in this position, pushing white's king to the side. So if the king would move here, then king to c4, and once again, if the king tries to stay in front of this pawn, then black would just gain the opposition again. And if the king would move straight back, then black could continue to grab the opposition. And now if the king would move, we have king to c2 just grabbing the queening square. So if the king would go after the pawn, we could have d5, and then here the king would just go up to guard the pawn. But no matter what white does, the pawn would make it through. And so the game could, I'll play it out to just show you. Let's say he goes back here. The pawn can just move forward. If he goes, let's say, to here to keep the king from guarding this queening square, the opposing king, then black would just gain the opposition again, and the king would have to move to the side. And then after this move, now black would be guarding all the squares leading up to the queening square, and black would win. And so if we go back to the beginning of the position and avoid that. So here's how the game started. White has only one move, e7, and then black must go after this pawn before it becomes a queen. And now that it has become a queen, he can capture. And then white must make this move here. He cannot capture this pawn, this f6 pawn, or it will lead to this variation that we looked at a little while ago. It will allow black to come around on the other side of the pawn and help escort it up to d1 to promote, and black would win. But in this position, white has the opposition here. And so there are different moves that black may play, but if he pushes a pawn forward with f5, then white would be forced to capture this pawn. And now it would give time for black to move forward, but it is too late, as king to e4, king to c6, the white king just jumps in front of this pawn and keeps the black king from getting in front of the pawn to help escort it forward. And so now after d5, white just moves directly backwards, staying in front of this pawn. And then when black's king moves forward, the king moves directly in front of the king, stopping the black king from making any forward progress. And so if the pawn is pushed forward, now white can just move directly in front of it, and the king cannot move forward, so the king would have to move backwards. And now white just moves directly in front of the pawn, one square backwards, and this allows him to move in front of the king. So from the center square here, if the king moves here, white can move directly in front of the king. If the king would have moved here to c4, then the white king could move directly in front of the black king on c2. And so white moves directly in front of the king, stopping the black king's forward progress. And so the pawn moves forward, and now white blocks the pawn by getting in front of it. And then once the king moves here to protect the pawn, white once again moves directly backwards, staying in front of that pawn. And then when the king moves up, he moves directly in front of that king, stopping its progress. And now if the pawn moves forward, once again, white blocks the pawn. But here, the only move to protect this pawn is king to d3 here, and that will lead to a stalemate and a draw. And so I hope you've enjoyed that endgame, a little demonstration there of king and pawn versus king and two pawns. Usually two pawns against a lone pawn would be enough of an advantage for the side with the extra pawn to win, but this was an interesting example of how to hold the draw even when you were behind in material there. So I hope you've enjoyed this chess endgame, and if you have, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you, and have a great day.